All right, so without further ado, let me introduce Marianne and Marie. Both of them are very accomplished researchers. Yep, Marianne and Marie are both accomplished researchers. Marianne leads the user research team at Teladoc Health, and she's established research practices at 3 other health tech companies. Prior to that, she was at Google and Adobe. And Marie is a senior user researcher at Teladoc as well. She arrives there after several years of working in a humanitarian context around the world, most notably in Afghanistan and Iraq, where she's led design and user research to help address some of the most difficult problems we face as humans. So without further ado, I'll transition to Marianne and Marie.
All right, great. Thanks for the introduction, Rob, and thanks to everyone at MadPow and everyone who sort of went into making this conference happen. We're super excited to be here. So I'd like to get us started by just taking us all back for a moment. So I'd like for everyone to close your eyes and think about where you were when you heard about COVID-19. When you found out that we would all need to stay home, that people were getting sick and dying, and we didn't know how to stop it. What were you thinking? What were you feeling? How did you feel in your body? What were you worried about? What new problems did you face at home and at work? And which solutions you had figured out to previous problems like caring for children, getting groceries, communicating with colleagues, were suddenly no longer viable. All right, now you can open your eyes. So when we got the shelter-in-place orders, I was certainly in a state of shock. I'd been working in international humanitarian settings like Afghanistan and Iraq, as Rob mentioned. So I was used to crises happening, but they were not necessarily unexpected. When a crisis hit, everyone around me knew exactly what to do. We would react the way we had been trained to manage that kind of situation. So when COVID-19 happened here, I looked around me and realized that very few people were actually doing those things. We were not really trained for this, and largely we were unprepared. So I realized that what I'd learned from working with incredible crisis management experts and doing research in crisis context might actually be useful. So I put it into an article and a podcast interview. And today we're going to share some of those conceptual foundations from crisis management. And then we're going to talk about our experience at Livongo of applying them to stay up on our users' shifting needs throughout COVID-19. And we'll leave you with some of our lessons learned and our takeaways on how we can use this experience to continue to support users to weather and bounce back better from this crisis, and also use this experience to be a more crisis-aware UX organization in the future. So let's get started by getting on the same page with some key basics in shared language from crisis management. So as we all know, our daily lives have a sort of rhythm to them. We might experience a stressful encounter or have a bad day, but for the most part, there's this straight, mostly predictable line of normalcy. So a shock is anything that comes along and disrupts that pattern of normalcy, and that requires some kind of response or action to stabilize the situation and either return to or establish some kind of new normal. So shocks can happen at the household level, like getting into an accident or getting laid off. But when they have an impact at the systems level, like a natural disaster or, say, a global pandemic, they tip into a crisis. And suddenly the way we do almost everything is no longer possible, or at least not possible in the same way, as I'm sure many of you were just reflecting a few moments ago. But it can be helpful to know that there is a crisis cycle. So in looking at this diagram, we'll start where many of us started a year ago in the response phase. So when a crisis hits, we're immediately jolted here. In this phase, actions are meant to stabilize the situation and tend to immediate needs. In a crisis like a natural disaster, for example, an earthquake, the crisis itself is over quickly, and then we're able to respond to its impacts. But with a protracted crisis like COVID-19, the crisis is ongoing while we're still responding. We close restaurants to contain COVID, and then we have a new shock of a whole industry out of work. We see case numbers tick up and tend to immediate health needs, then cases retreat down, and we change our policies and restrictions until we see the next major change. So instead of a linear process where a crisis happens and then you tend to immediate needs, it tends to be a more cyclical and repetitive cycle of mini crisis cycles from aftershocks within this overall crisis. So with this, in a protracted crisis like COVID-19, throughout this response phase, the problems that you and your users are facing this week might not be the same as the problems they need to solve in a few days or in a few weeks as the crisis continues to unfold. Once we've responded to immediate needs and we're no longer constrained by the ongoing crisis, we start to look towards returning to or establishing a new normal, and we enter the recovery phase. This involves effort at the individual and systems levels to restore our physical, economic, and social well-being to what it was before, or ideally even better than it was before the crisis occurred. And once that normalcy is completely stabilized, we're in a non-crisis stage, looking to the left side of this cycle, mitigation and preparedness. At this stage, we can learn from the experience and take measures to be better prepared and mitigate the impact of a future similar crisis so that we aren't caught unprepared again. Or ideally, we do this before we experience the crisis at all. As I'm sure we all know at this point, we don't tend to do our best thinking and decision-making during a crisis. Similar to what Taylor Cashton spoke about earlier, when we're in a crisis, we're often experiencing that amygdala hijack. So the main goal in this phase is to do whatever we can while we're able to think more clearly and have the time to plan and prepare. So how we manage response and recovery all really depends on resilience, which is just having the capacity and resources to cope effectively without having to resort to negative or potentially harmful coping mechanisms. And resilience is crisis specific. It's possible to have the resources and capacity to cope well in one kind of crisis, but not another. And when it comes to individuals' resilience, the factors that affect whether someone can weather a crisis effectively really closely mirror the social determinants of health. So someone's neighborhood and built environment, their health and educational resources, social and community context, economic stability, these can all impact their resilience and ability to cope effectively. When it comes to organizations, resilience looks a little bit different. So it also includes things like their economic stability, but also their ability to be flexible and adaptive and respond instead of getting stuck in decision-making paralysis, and to do so in a way that doesn't compromise their ability to recover over the longer term. As I'm sure many of us experienced, businesses and organizations typically look inward when going into response mode, focusing on their organizational entity and human resources and their capacity to cope with the crisis and mobilize a business response. However, being a truly crisis-aware organization means also considering the capacity of your users to cope effectively and looking at where your user experience might potentially expose them to additional vulnerability or potentially support and increase their resilience and support their capacity to cope, adapt, and solve the new problems that are materializing for them. So now let's hear a little bit about what this looked like at Livongo.
Thanks, Marie. So about a year ago, I was definitely part of those folks that we were talking about, the untrained and unprepared. When the crisis hit, didn't know what to do at all. And I was super lucky to come across Marie's article and able to follow it. And you might also notice that both Marie and I are at Teladoc and not Livongo. And that was another one of the changes that's happened in the past year, is that Livongo was acquired by Teladoc, and Marie came to work for us at about that same time in the fall. So a little bit about Livongo. Livongo was a 6-year-old telehealth company whose mission was to empower people living with chronic conditions to live healthier lives. What we offer is programs in diabetes, hypertension, weight management, both through connected devices that help people track their data, as well as having coaches, live coaches available, and using AI with nudges and other support to help people throughout their day. And when the crisis hit, as a company, we were well positioned already. Half of us were already working remotely, most of our coaches, what we affectionately know as the Remote Nation. So some of those changes to working remotely and some of the changes to the business didn't hit us as hard. But definitely those questions about what about the resilience of our products and services that we were offering to our members? That was a question that came up. That question and a lot of other questions. There was a lot of uncertainty that we had, and a lot of uncertainty that still remains. You know, we had questions are, how are our members, that's what we call our users, how are they doing? Are we supplying them with the information that they need? Are our products and services meeting their needs? Is there something different that we should be offering? And will they even talk to researchers to find out what's changed and to see if there's any changes that we can make? What are people even in a state to be able to talk to us? So there's definitely a lot of confusion, a lot of lack of information that we had about what was happening with our members. So having read Marie's article, I started to put together a plan. And the first step of that plan was a one-question lightweight survey that went into our mobile app and into our member portal or our website for our members that just asked, these are challenging times, how are you doing? And we categorized those answers into mostly positive, mostly negative, mixed, or neutral. And we were able to track those sentiments over time, as well as to look for themes in people's answers. So user research wasn't the only folks who were talking to members and had access to members. We decided that because there were so many other folks in the organization who were talking to users, that there was an opportunity to pull those things together. So I put together a proposal to put together a weekly member snapshot that combined what user research we were hearing from that survey, what data science was seeing from the behavioral data. For example, are people checking their blood pressure less during this pandemic? What we're hearing from our coaches who are able to support our members in one-on-one conversations, to hold space for whatever issues they were facing, to really normalize what they were going through, as well as our content and marketing folks who send the emails, the newsletters, put up the FAQs, and share information with our members. So we were able to combine all those things into a weekly member snapshot that we sent out to the company on a weekly basis. And that distribution list seemed to grow every week as there was much more hunger and much more interest in what we were hearing from members and how they were doing. We kept that weekly cadence going for about 6 weeks, then tamped it down to about a bi-weekly cadence when we saw that the rate of learning was slowing down a little bit. And then after a month or two, we ramped that down again. But what we had was an infrastructure that we could ramp up as needed and activate it when things change. So for example, we're reactivating it now as we have vaccinations, as we have reopenings. So it's an infrastructure that we have already that we can ramp up again as needed. So what did we learn from this? Well, one of the things that we learned is our programs being virtual and already being internet connected and being remote already were a good fit for the constraints of this particular crisis. We also found that, we make medical devices, software is a medical device. Those things aren't easily changeable in a crisis, and we can't do a lot with making the changes there. However, what we could easily change was the content and emails, newsletters, and provide people with credible information that they could use, and we could rapidly respond and change that quickly and have a big impact. And we could use the information that we were hearing real time from the coaches from the user research survey to adapt and change the content of those emails. And as I was saying, we were working in a very dynamic way. Every week we're evaluating, should we run another member snapshot? Are we still learning? We're doing just-in-time planning rather than longer-term quarterly planning or anything like that. So that dynamic way of working really helped us with the short cycles. And in that, we had created an infrastructure to get real-time information across, many teams and across behavioral, attitudinal, lots of information coming together in one place, and having this infrastructure to systematically document what we're hearing and share it back with the organization for quick decision-making. So I'll hand it back to Marie to tell us what we might do from here.
Great, thanks, Marianne. Yeah, so a lot of you might be thinking right now, this would have been a really helpful talk a year ago, but what are we supposed to do with this now? As we've all learned, we're actually pretty adaptive. So many of us have somehow gotten used to living in this crisis context. And as we see vaccines rolling out, it can feel like we're already in recovery. But remember, we're not truly out of the response phase until there are no more crisis-related immediate needs to tend to, and we're able to make decisions without the constraints of the ongoing crisis. So with that, there's still more we can do to deliver crisis-aware and resilient user experiences right now. This is not a one and done process, so as things keep changing, so should our UX response. And it's easy to get people on board when the crisis hits and people are hungry for a sense of control to counter all of that uncertainty. But this is where it really counts, staying crisis aware in our business and our UX for the long haul until we're really out of the woods. The good news is we're also able to prepare and mitigate right now. We aren't really being caught as off guard anymore. We have a clearer picture of aftershocks that may still be to come. For example, navigating vaccinations, potential future surges, the health consequences of a year of missed appointments or delayed treatments, mental health crises. The steps we're about to share for crisis-aware UX can still be deployed to help manage our UX and support users through the remainder of COVID-19 and these potential aftershocks, as well as doing that work of creating a new normal and ideally bouncing back better than before. And if I haven't convinced you yet, beyond COVID-19, these steps can also make us better prepared to manage crises and other situations of all kinds in the future, from a pandemic to natural disasters to a supply disruption or a new competitor entering the market or a sudden policy change that affects our product and service. So what could enable a crisis-aware, resilient UX? First, identifying the areas of the UX that can be dynamic and responsive during a crisis and focusing your efforts there. As Marianne explained at Livongo, it didn't look like changing our software or our medical devices. It looked like dealing with content and emails and things that could actually be adaptive in real time during a crisis. So if it can't be dynamic, it doesn't need to play a central role in your crisis-aware UX strategy. Next, it's a matter of getting buy-in and building a crisis-ready culture, one where individuals, teams, and systems are comfortable with and empowered to reassess, adapt, and shift priorities in real time when a shock occurs, and then to stay dynamic throughout the remainder of that crisis. This also means getting buy-in from decision makers on how crisis-ready and crisis-responsive your organization is really willing to be and what that can look like. Next, of course, you have to make someone responsible. Someone has to be responsible for crisis management in your user experience, which might be different than crisis management for the business itself. When a crisis hits, you don't want to lose time getting organized. Ideally, your organization should have a standing UX-based rapid response team with representation from the parts of your UX that can be dynamic during a crisis, as well as those that can rapidly provide insights into what is happening for your users, similar to what Marianne shared about the range of stakeholders we mobilized to provide real-time user insights at Livongo. And then lastly, to get prepared and do what you can in the mitigation phase, you can prioritize and contingency plan for high-risk shocks. So practically what this looks like is that you start with brainstorming potential shocks or aftershocks, which is where we're at right now with COVID-19, and look at those that could impact your users' needs, goals, and behaviors related to your user experience. Then it's a matter of assessing the risk associated with each shock. And risk is simply a function of the likelihood a shock will occur, how exposed or vulnerable your users or user experience is to it, and the potential impact it would have on your users and UX. An estimation here is fine. It's not an exact science. You're just trying to give yourself enough to objectively prioritize. And you should assess all possible shocks, but you don't have to plan for every possible shock you can think of, only those that are actually high risk. So once you prioritize the highest risks, it's just a matter of coming up with a plan for what it would take to have just enough information to reliably understand what's happening for your users when that shock occurs, and to the extent possible, proactively identifying options you might consider for how to respond in your user experience. If you've done all of this, when a crisis or a shock occurs, you should be able to move quickly into a response by activating your UX rapid response team. So you've figured out what risks to keep an eye on, the information you would need to know about your users if it occurred, and how your product or service could potentially respond or adapt. Now, in this phase, it's just a matter of doing it and keep doing it. So you adjust as you go, be flexible with the ebb and flow of intensity as the crisis demands from one day or week or month to the next throughout response and recovery. In this phase, you should also continue to identify, monitor, and respond to new and ongoing shocks and risks. Especially in a prolonged crisis like COVID-19, contingency planning should be an ongoing exercise. So as the situation continues to unfold, continue to look ahead at what's changing and what's to come, and start to use preparedness and mitigation strategies to shift from being reactive to proactive in your user experience. And then lastly, it's just a matter of stabilizing and bouncing back better. So remember, we're not our users, and crises may affect all of us, but they don't affect all of us the same. It isn't over until it's truly over for everyone. And this holds true all the way through recovery. It's not just about responding, but about helping our users and our user experience get back to normal, and ideally a better normal than what we had before. And with that, we'll leave the remainder of the time for questions.
All right, awesome. Really fascinating talk. I always found it interesting how we can kind of dig in and find these frameworks and sort of apply them across the work we do. It's always kind of like a lot of insight gets derived there. I have a question from Indret. This sounds a little like what I've been learning about trauma-informed design. What would you say the difference between crisis-aware and trauma-informed is, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've done a bit of work in trauma-informed design as well, and I think there are a lot of similar and overlapping concepts. I guess I would just say that the lens of trauma-informed design is really about the individual and designing experiences that aren't triggering or exacerbating trauma for individual users. And I think the crisis-aware lens is maybe more at the systems level and looking at sort of the shifting and evolving crisis context and what you can do to adapt and respond.
Great, super helpful. Yeah, I mean, well, I think one thing, we get another question here from Michael. How do you respond to members who express that they were struggling or really needed help?
I can take that one. So one thing that you're not going to be surprised to hear is that you have a response bias in terms of who's answering the survey itself. So probably the people who were struggling and who most needed help, we weren't hearing from. The most that we could do is from the things that we were hearing and from the struggles that we've heard, we could send out more content, we could offer help, we can remind people of their coaches that they could reach out to. So we could make ourselves available, but to be honest, we're probably not hearing from those who are struggling, who are truly struggling and in true need.
Yeah, that's super helpful. So that's all the questions that we have. This was a great talk. I feel like there's a lot of really actionable stuff in here. Oh, we got one more question here again from Michael, and this will be the last question. How do your findings about your members compare to other findings about the rest of the population?
That's a good question. I know that one of the things that we did with our our blood pressure data, that we actually made that publicly available so we could see the differences that, kind of what was happening and what we saw in the larger population as opposed to the people who are actually answering the survey. So we were able to make some comparisons that way and to share some of that information that way. So.
Great. Well, awesome. Again, thank you so much for your talk here. Really insightful.